Modern United States Navy aircraft carrier air operations include the operation of fixed-wing and rotary aircraft on and around an aircraft carrier, for performance of combat and non-combat missions. Modern United States Navy aircraft carrier flight operations are highly evolved, based on experiences dating back to 1922 with the USS Langley flight deck crew. The flight deck crews of a carrier air wing wear colored jerseys to distinguish the functions. Everyone associated with the flight deck has a specific job, which is indicated by the color of his deck jersey, float coat and helmet. Rank is also denoted by the pattern of trousers worn by flight deck crew. Navy blue pants denotes junior sailors and petty officers. Khaki pants denotes chief, petty, warrant and commissioned officers. This keeps in line with the traditional khaki color of CPO and officer service uniforms. When a distinguished visitor arrives on the ship by air, a call to muster the Rainbow Side Boys is made. Typically, two of each colored jersey stand opposite each other in front of the entrance to the ship to render honors to the DV. These sailors in their colored jerseys are referred to as Rainbow Side Boys. Air officer, also known as the air boss. The air officer is responsible for all aspects of operations involving aircraft, including the hangar deck, the flight deck, and airborne aircraft out to 5 nautical miles from the carrier. From his perch in primary flight control, he and his assistant maintain visual control of all aircraft operating in the carrier control zone, within a circular limit defined by 5 nautical miles horizontal radius from the carrier, and aircraft desiring to operate within the control zone must obtain his approval prior to entry. The normal working jersey color of an air boss is yellow, but an air boss may wear any color jersey, as he represents everyone working on the flight deck, hangar bay, and aviation fuels personnel. Catapult officer, also known as shooters. Catapult officers are naval aviators or naval flight officers and are responsible for all aspects of catapult maintenance and operation. They ensure that there is sufficient wind over the deck and that the steam settings for the catapults will ensure that aircraft have sufficient flying speed at the end of the stroke. Aircraft handling officer, also known as the aircraft handler. The ARCO is responsible for arrangement of aircraft about the flight and hangar decks. The handler is charged with avoiding a locked deck, where there are too many misplaced aircraft such that no more can land prior to a rearrangement. The handler works in flight deck control, where scale model aircraft on a flight deck representation are used to represent actual aircraft status on the flight deck. Aircraft directors, as the name implies, are responsible for directing all aircraft movement on the hangar and flight decks. They are enlisted aviation bosun's mates. They are colloquially known as spares, and those who work in the hangar go by the term hangar rat. On some carriers, commissioned officers known as flight deck officers also serve as aircraft directors. During flight operations or during a flight deck respot, there are typically about 12 to 15 yellow shirts on the flight deck, and they report directly to the handler. Although aircraft directors are often used at airports ashore, the function is particularly crucial in the confined flight deck environment where aircraft are routinely taxied within inches of one another, often with the ship rolling and pitching beneath. Directors wear yellow and use a complex set of hand signals to direct aircraft. Landing signal officer. The landing signal officer is a qualified, experienced pilot who is responsible for the visual control of aircraft in the terminal phase of the approach immediately prior to landing. LSOs ensure that approaching aircraft are properly configured, and they monitor aircraft glider path angle, altitude, and lineup. They communicate with landing pilots via voice, radio, and light signals. Arresting gear officer. The arresting gear officer is responsible for arresting gear operation, settings, and monitoring landing area deck status. Arresting gear engines are set to apply varying resistance to the arresting cable based on the type of aircraft landing. Cyclic operations. Cyclic operations refers to the launch and recovery cycle for aircraft in groups or cycles. Launching and recovering aircraft aboard aircraft carriers is best accomplished non-concurrently, and cyclic operations are the norm for U.S. aircraft carriers. Cycles are generally about 1.5 hours long, although cycles as short as an hour or as long as an hour and 45 minutes are not uncommon. The shorter the cycle, the fewer aircraft can be launched, recovered. The longer the cycle, the more critical fuel becomes for airborne aircraft. Events are typically made up of about 12 to 20 aircraft and are sequentially numbered throughout the 24-hour flight day. Prior to flight operations, the aircraft on the flight deck are arranged so that Event 1 aircraft can easily be taxied to the catapults once they have been started and inspected. Once the Event 1 aircraft are launched, Event 2 aircraft are readied for launch about an hour later. The launching of all these aircraft makes room on the flight deck to then land aircraft. Once Event 2 aircraft are launched, Event 1 aircraft are recovered, fueled, rearmed, respotted and readied to be used for Event 3. Event 3 aircraft are launched, followed by the recovery of Event 2 aircraft. After the last recovery of the day, all of the aircraft are generally stored up on the bow. They are then respotted about the flight deck for the next morning's first launch. Pre-launch. Approximately 45 minutes before launch time, flight crews conduct walk-around inspections and man their aircraft. Approximately 30 minutes prior to launch, aircraft are started, and pre-flight inspections are conducted. Approximately 15 minutes prior to launch, ready aircraft are taxied from the parked positions and spotted on or immediately behind the catapults. The ship is turned into the natural wind. As an aircraft is taxied onto the catapult, the wings are spread and a large jet blast deflector panel rises out of the flight deck behind the engine exhaust. Prior to final catapult hookup, final checkers make final exterior checks of the aircraft, and loaded weapons are armed by ordnancemen. Catapult launch. Catapult hookup is accomplished by placing the aircraft launch bar, which is attached to the front of the aircraft's nose landing gear, into the catapult shuttle. An additional bar, the holdback, is connected from the rear of the nose landing gear to the carrier deck. The holdback fitting keeps the aircraft from moving forward prior to catapult firing. In final preparation for launch, a series of events happens in rapid succession, indicated by hand light signals. The catapult is put into tension whereby all the slack is taken out of the system with hydraulic pressure on the rear of the shuttle. The pilot is then signaled to advance the throttles to full power, and he takes his feet off the brakes. The pilot checks engine instruments and wipes out all the control surfaces. The pilot indicates that he is satisfied that his aircraft is ready for flight by saluting the catapult officer. At night, he turns on the aircraft's exterior lights to indicate he is ready. During this time, 2 or more final checkers are observing the exterior of the aircraft for proper flight control movement, engine response, panel security and leaks. Once satisfied, the checkers give a thumbs up to the CAT officer. The CAT officer makes a final check of catapult settings, wind, etc., and gives the signal to launch. The catapult operator then pushes a button firing the catapult. Once the catapult fires, the holdback breaks free as the shuttle moves rapidly forward, dragging the aircraft by the launch bar. The aircraft accelerates from 0 to approximately 150 knots in about 2 seconds. There is typically wind over the flight deck, giving the aircraft additional lift. Post-launch procedures used after launch are based on meteorological and environmental conditions. Departure recovery types. There are three types of departure and recovery operations, which are referred to as Case I, Case II, and Case III. Primary responsibility for adherence to the departure rests with the pilot. However, advisory control is given by the ship's departure control radar operators, including when dictated by weather conditions. Case I, when it is anticipated that flights will not encounter instrument conditions during daytime departures, recoveries, and the ceiling and visibility around the carrier are no lower than 3,000 feet and 5 nautical miles respectively. Immediately after becoming airborne, aircraft raise the landing gear and perform clearing turns to the right off the bow and to the left off the waist catapults. This still the 10 degrees check turn is to increase separation of simultaneously launched aircraft from the waist bow catapults. After the clearing turn, aircraft proceed straight ahead paralleling the ship's course at 500 feet until 7 nautical miles. Aircraft are then cleared to climb unrestricted in visual conditions. Case II, when it is anticipated that flights may encounter instrument conditions during a daytime departure, recovery, and the ceiling and visibility in the carrier control zone are no lower than 1,000 feet and 5 nautical miles respectively, used for an overcast condition. After a clearing turn, aircraft proceed straight ahead at 500 feet paralleling ship's course. At 7 nautical miles, aircraft turn to intercept a 10 nm arc about the ship, maintaining visual conditions until established outbound on their assigned departure radial, at which time they are free to climb through the weather. The 500-foot restriction is lifted after 7 nautical miles if the climb can be continued in visual conditions. Case III, when it is anticipated that flights will encounter instrument conditions during a departure, recovery because the ceiling of visibility around the carrier are lower than 1,000 feet and 5 nautical miles respectively, or for nighttime departures, recoveries. A minimum launch interval of 30 seconds is used between aircraft, which climb straight ahead. At 7 nautical miles, they turn to fly the 10 nm arc until intercepting their assigned departure radial. Flight operations. Aircraft are often launched from the carrier in a somewhat random order based on their deck positioning prior to launch. Therefore, aircraft working together on the same mission must rendezvous airborne. This is accomplished at a predetermined location, usually at the in-flight refueling tanker overhead the carrier, or at an en route location. Properly equipped FA-180F Super Hornets provide organic refueling, or U.S. Air Force tankers provide non-organic tanking. After rendezvous tanking, aircraft proceed on mission. All aircraft within the carrier's radar coverage are tracked and monitored. As aircraft enter the carrier control area, a 50 nautical mile radius around the carrier, they are given more scrutiny. Once air-wing aircraft have been identified, they are normally turned over to Marshal Control for further clearance to the Marshal Pattern. Recovery operations. As with departures, the type of recovery is based on the meteorological conditions and are referred to as Case I, Case II, or Case III. Case I aircraft awaiting recovery hold in the port holding pattern, a left-hand circle tangent to the ship's course with the ship in the 3 o'clock position, and a maximum diameter of 5 nautical miles. Aircraft typically hold in close formations of 2 or more and are stacked at various altitudes based on the type. Squadron. Minimum holding altitude is 2,000 feet, with a minimum of 1,000 feet vertical separation between holding altitudes. Flights arrange themselves to establish proper separation for landing. As the launching aircraft clear the flight deck and landing area becomes clear, the lowest aircraft in holding descend and depart the stack in final preparation for landing. Higher aircraft descend in the stack to altitudes vacated by lower holding aircraft. The final descent from the bottom of the stack is planned so as to arrive at the initial, which is 3 nautical miles astern the ship at 800 feet. Paralleling the ship's course, the aircraft are then flown over the ship and break into the landing pattern, ideally establishing at 50 to 60-second intervals on the aircraft in front of them. If there are too many aircraft in the landing pattern when a flight arrives at the ship, the flight leader initiates a spin, climbing up slightly and executing a tight 360 degrees turn within 3 nautical miles of the ship. The break is a level 180 degrees turn made at 800 feet, descending to 600 feet when established downwind. Landing gear, flaps are lowered, and landing checks are completed. When abeam the landing area on downwind, the aircraft is 180 degrees from the ship's course and approximately 1.5 nautical miles from the ship, a position known as the 180. The pilot begins his turn to final while simultaneously beginning a gentle descent. At the 90, the aircraft is at 450 feet, about 1.2 nautical miles from the ship, with 90 degrees of turn to go. The final checkpoint for the pilot is crossing the ship's way, at which time the aircraft should be approaching final landing heading and at approximately 350 feet. At this point, the pilot acquires the optical landing system, which is used for the terminal portion of the landing. During this time, the pilot's full attention is devoted to maintaining proper glider slope, line-up, and angle of attack until touchdown. Lined up on landing area centerline is critical because it is only 120 feet in length, and aircraft are often parked within a few feet either side. This is accomplished visually during case-eye using the painted ladder lines on the sides of the landing area and the centerline, drop line. Maintaining radio silence, or zip-lip, during case-eye launches and recoveries is the norm, breaking radio silence only for safety of flight issues. Case 2. This approach is utilized when weather conditions are such that the flight may encounter instrument conditions during the descent, but visual conditions of at least 1,000 feet ceiling and 5 nautical miles visibility exist at the ship. Positive radar control is utilized until the pilot is inside 10 nautical miles and reports the ship in sight. Flight leaders follow Case 3 approach procedures outside 10 nautical miles. When within 10 nautical miles with the ship in sight, flights are shifted to tower control and proceed as in Case I. Case 3. This approach is utilized whenever existing weather at the ship is below Case 2 minimums and during all-night flight operations. Case 3 recoveries are made with single aircraft, with no formations except in an emergency situation. All aircraft are assigned holding at a Marshall fix, typically about 150 degrees from the ship's base recovery course, at a unique distance and altitude. The holding pattern is a left-hand, 6-minute racetrack pattern. Each pilot adjusts his holding pattern to depart Marshall precisely at the assigned time. Aircraft departing Marshall will normally be separated by 1 minute. Adjustments may be directed by the ship's carrier air traffic control center, if required, to ensure proper separation. In order to maintain proper separation of aircraft, parameters must be precisely flown. Aircraft descend at 250 knots and 4,000 feet per minute until 5,000 feet is reached, at which point the descent is lessened to 2,000 feet per minute. Aircraft transition to a landing configuration at 10 nautical miles from the ship. If the stack is held more than 10 degrees away from the final bearing, then at 12.5 nautical miles, the pilot will arc at 250 knots, and then intercept that final bearing, to proceed with the approach, no matter what, since the landing area is angled approximately 10 degrees from the axis of the ship. Aircraft final approach heading is approximately 10 degrees less than the ship's heading. Aircraft on the standard approach without an arc still have to correct from the Marshall radial to the final bearing, and this is done in such case at 20 nautical miles. As the ship moves through the water, the aircraft must make continual minor corrections to the right to stay on the final bearing. If the ship makes course correction, which is often done in order to make the relative wind go directly down the angled deck, or to avoid obstacles, line up to center line must be corrected. The further the aircraft is from the ship, the larger the correction required. Aircraft pass through the 6 nautical mile fix at 1,200 feet altitude, 150 knots, in the landing configuration and commence slowing to final approach speed. At 3 nautical miles, aircraft begin a gradual 3 to 4 degrees descent until touchdown, in order to arrive precisely in position to complete the landing visually behind the ship at 400 feet. A number of instrument systems procedures are used. Once the pilot acquires visual contact with the optical landing aids, the pilot will call the ball. Control will then be assumed by the LSO, who issues final landing clearance with a Roger ball call. When other systems are not available, aircraft on final approach will continue the descent using distance altitude checkpoints at 3 nautical miles, 860 feet at 2 nautical miles, 460 feet at 1 nautical mile, 360 feet at the ball call approach. The carrier-controlled approach is analogous to ground-controlled approach using the ship's precision approach radar. Pilots are told where they are in relation to glider slope and final bearing. The pilot then makes a correction and awaits further information from the controller. The instrument carrier landing system is very similar to civilian ILS systems and is used on virtually all Case 3 approaches. A bullseye is displayed for the pilot, indicating aircraft position in relation to glider slope and final bearing. The automatic carrier landing system is similar to the ICLS, in that it displays needles that indicate aircraft position in relation to glider slope and final bearing. An approach utilizing this system is said to be a Mode 2 approach. Additionally, some aircraft are capable of coupling their autopilots to the glider slope azimuth signals received via data link from the ship, allowing for a hands-off approach. If the pilot keeps the autopilot coupled until touchdown, this is referred to as a Mode I approach. If the pilot maintains a couple until the visual approach point, this is referred to as a Mode IA approach. The long-range laser line-up system uses eye-safe lasers, projected after the ship, to give pilots a visual indication of the line-up with relation to centerline. The LLS is typically used from as much as 10 nautical miles until the landing area can be seen at around 1 nautical mile. Regardless of the case recovery or approach type, the final portion of the landing to touchdown is flown visually. Line up with the landing area is achieved by lining up painted lines on the landing area centerline with the set of lights that drops from the back of the flight deck. Proper glider slope is maintained using the Fresnel lens optical landing system, improved Fresnel lens optical landing system, or manually operated visual landing aid system. If an aircraft is pulled off the approach or is waved off by the LSO or misses all the arresting wires, the pilot climbs straight ahead to 1,200 feet to the alter wave-off pattern and waits for instructions from approach control. Landing The pilot aims for the middle arresting wire, which is either the second or third depending on the configuration of the carrier. Immediately upon touchdown, the pilot advances the throttles to full power so that a touch and go can be executed in the event that all trap wires have been missed. Ideally, the tailhook catches the target wire, which abruptly slows the aircraft from approach speed to a full stop in about 2 seconds. As the aircraft's forward motion stops, the throttles are reduced to idle, and the hook is raised on the aircraft director's signal. The aircraft director then directs the aircraft to clear the landing area in preparation for the next landing. Remaining ordnance is disarmed, wings are folded, and aircraft are taxied to parking spots and shut down. Immediately upon shutdown, the aircraft is refueled, rearmed, and inspected. Minor maintenance is performed, and it is often re-spot prior to the next launch cycle. Carrier qualifications. The purpose of carrier qualifications is to give pilots a dedicated opportunity to develop fundamental skills associated with operating fixed-wing, carrier-based aircraft and demonstrate acceptable levels of proficiency required for qualification. During CQ, there are typically far fewer aircraft on the flight deck than during cyclic operations. This allows for much easier simultaneous launch and recovery of aircraft. The waste catapults are generally not used. Aircraft can trap and be taxied immediately to a bow catapult for launch. Types and requirements. Carrier qualification is performed for new pilots and periodically for experienced pilots to maintain carrier landing currency. Requirements are based on the experience of the pilot and the length of time since his last arrested landing. Undergraduate CQ is for student naval aviators, currently completed in the T-45 Goshawk and consisting of 14-day landings. Initial CQ is flown in a newly designated aviator's first fleet aircraft, consisting of 12-day and 8-night landings. Transition CQ is for experienced pilots transitioning from one type of aircraft to another, consisting of 12-day landings and 6-night arrested landings. Requalification CQ is for experienced pilots that have not flown from the carrier within the previous 6 months, consisting of 6-day arrested landings and 4-night arrested landings. Gallery